can't even keep the lights on," Sandra said, sliding the envelope across the kitchen table like it was something she'd been holding on to for weeks. "How is that supposed to be a life?" In the hallway, 9-year-old Coop stood very still in his socks, his back against the wall, listening to the silence that followed. Elliot Voss said nothing. He looked at the envelope the way a man looks at weather he already knew was coming. His hands were on the table in front of him, wide hands, a carpenter's hands, with a ridge of callus along the right palm and a faint blue bruise under one thumbnail from a misdirected hammer swing 2 days before. He did not reach for the envelope. Sandra's coat was on. That was the detail that stayed with him. She had walked into this conversation already dressed to leave. 7 years, she said. Her voice was not cruel exactly, but it had the flatness of something decided. 7 years of this. The same rented house, the same van with the same rust spot above the wheel. You said it was temporary. Every year you said that. Elliot looked at the window above the sink. The glass was fogged at the corners from the cold outside, the kind of November cold that settles into the bones of old houses and does not leave until April. "I'm not saying it's temporary anymore," he said quietly. That seemed to make it worse. Sandra had expected a defense. She had prepared for one. His stillness moved through her like a draft under a door. "There's someone else." She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, chin lifted, watching for the wound. "His name is Sheldon. He's in commercial development. He's building something real, Elliot. That's what I need. Someone who's actually building something." Elliot knew the name. Sheldon Price. He had seen it in the property filings that crossed his desk 4 months ago. A man leveraging capital he didn't fully own, raising towers on borrowed confidence. Elliot had reviewed the financing architecture of 3 of Price's projects in the last year alone, reviewed it from the other side of a table in a glass office in Toronto that Sandra had never once visited, because Sandra did not know that table existed. He said none of that. He looked across at the woman he had married in a civil ceremony with $40 in his checking account and a future she could not have imagined. And he felt, beneath the ache of it, a clarity so cold and clean it almost didn't hurt. "All right," he said. Sandra blinked. "All right, that's it. What would you like me to say?" She stared at him. Something flickered behind her eyes, some last reach toward a feeling she had expected to find and couldn't. Then she straightened, picked up the envelope, and told him she'd be back for her things at the weekend. That they'd work out Coop. "We'll work out Coop," Elliot repeated, and she looked at him sharply because there was something in the way he said it that she could not name and did not like. She left at 6. A silver car was idling at the curb in the dark. Coop stood at the front window and watched it pull away, and Elliot stood behind him and put one hand on the boy's shoulder and felt him breathing. The house on Cartwright Lane smelled of sawdust and pine resin, and the particular chill of a furnace that ran on a timer to save on gas. Elliot had bought the place 4 years ago with cash, paid through a numbered account and a property trust his attorney had set up, and he rented it to himself at market rate so that nothing about his life on Cartwright Lane looked like anything other than what it appeared to be, a tradesman. Doing fine, not great. He had learned the value of appearing unremarkable. He had learned it the hard way. In the garage, under a drop cloth and a stack of old storm windows he kept meaning to throw out, there was a fireproof cabinet. Coop had been told it held important documents. That was true in the way that calling the ocean a puddle is technically not a lie. The morning after Sandra left, Elliot made oatmeal. He put Coop's lunch together, sandwich, apple, one of those granola bars the boy would eat around the chocolate chips and leave the rest of on the wrapper. He smoothed down the back of the boy's hair and drove him to school in the rust-spotted van and kissed the top of his head at the doors and watched until the small figure in the green jacket disappeared inside. Then he drove to the hardware store, bought a box of deck screws, and went home and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and thought about a phone call he had not yet returned. It had come the evening before, while Sandra was upstairs packing a bag, a number he recognized before he finished reading it. A Montreal exchange, a private line belonging to a woman named Harriet Sue, who ran the board of Aldercroft Capital like a chess player who had already seen 30 moves ahead. Elliot had not spoken to Harriet in 11 months. He had been hoping, in the quiet way of a man who knows better than to hope, that the silence would hold. He called her back. "We need you in the room," she said, without preamble. Harriet had never believed in preamble. "The Donnelly Infrastructure Fund. You designed the whole structure, Elliot. The trustees have spent 6 months trying to navigate it without you, and they are about to make a decision that will collapse the entire thing. $3 billion. Provincial pension exposure. You understand what that means." He did. "If we bring you back into this," Harriet said, "there's no doing it quietly. You've been the shadow in this operation for 4 years. If you step into that boardroom, your name goes on the record. It goes everywhere." A pause. "You understand what we're asking?" Through the thin wall of the upstairs hallway he could hear, or imagined he could hear, his son's slow breathing in the next room. "I understand," Elliot said. He sat at the table for a long time after he hung up. The coffee went cold. The furnace cycled on and filled the house with its low hum. The rust-spotted van sat at the curb. The man that Sandra had left because he would never be anybody sat in the house that man lived in the town that man lived in, and looked at his own hands on the table. Tomorrow, he thought, was going to be different. He did not rush. That was the part people later found hardest to understand when the story finally came out. He went to work the next day. He picked up Coop from school. He made pasta for dinner and helped with the math worksheet that had been sitting unfinished since Monday. And he let the boy beat him at 2 rounds of the card game they kept in a shoebox on the shelf in the living room. He tucked Coop in and sat on the edge of the bed while the boy fell asleep, and then he went downstairs and opened his laptop and began to work. He worked quietly, the way he did everything, until 2 in the morning. By the end of the week, the Donnelly Fund had been stabilized. The decision the trustees had been about to make had been reversed, and the reversal had required Elliot's name on a document for the first time in 4 years. The document was filed with the provincial securities regulator. It was a matter of public record. It named the principal architect of the Aldercroft Capital Fund structure, the man who had designed the entire framework and held a controlling interest in 3 of its subsidiary vehicles. The name was Elliot Voss. The number attached to the name was large enough that the financial desk at one of the Toronto dailies ran it the following Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, it had moved to the National Wire. By Thursday, the business programs were using the phrase, "the most significant private wealth disclosure in Ontario in a decade," and reporters were chasing a man they had a name for but no face. On Thursday evening, Elliot made soup. Coop sat at the counter doing spelling words. "Dad," Coop said, not looking up from his notebook, "some kid at school said you're on the news." "Probably a different Elliot Voss." Coop looked up. "He showed me on his phone." Elliot stirred the soup. "Is it true?" the boy asked. Elliot set down the spoon and turned around. He looked at his son. The boy's careful eyes, the way he held his pen, the same particular stillness that Elliot recognized because he had been told for years that Coop came by it honestly. "Yes," Elliot said. "It's true." Coop was quiet for a moment. "Are we still going to live here?" "Do you want to live here?" The boy thought about this seriously. "I want to keep my room." "Then we'll keep your room." Coop nodded and went back to his spelling words. The revelation settled over the city the way revelations do. First as gossip, then as news, then as a kind of weather everyone was living under whether they followed financial reporting or not. Aldercroft Capital. The Donnelly Fund. The man who had been operating out of a rented house in a working neighborhood, who drove a van, who no one had seen, who no one had connected to any of it. Sandra read about it on her phone on a Saturday morning in Sheldon's apartment downtown, in the kind of building that had a concierge and a gym on the 14th floor. She had been there 3 weeks. She read the name 3 times before she let herself understand it. She thought about the garage. She thought about the drop cloth and the old storm windows and what she had always assumed was under them. She thought about the phone calls Elliot took outside, always walking to the end of the driveway and back. She thought about the men who had occasionally appeared at the house over the years, careful men in unremarkable clothing who spoke to Elliot in low voices on the front step and never came in. She set her phone face down on the duvet and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Sheldon had no idea. That was also true. He came out of the bathroom and asked what she wanted for breakfast, and she looked at him. The easy confidence, the good shoes, The way he had of talking about his projects as though no one could possibly be unimpressed, and said she wasn't hungry. Elliot had not planned the moment it became public, but he had thought, over 4 years, about what he would do when it did. He did nothing dramatic. He gave no press conference. He let the firm's communications team handle the requests, which they did efficiently, because they had been prepared for exactly this. He kept driving Cop to school. He kept making oatmeal. He answered Harriet's calls and attended, when he had to, the meetings that could not be done remotely. The first meeting he could not avoid was in Toronto, a gathering of the infrastructure fund's major institutional partners, people who had trusted a structure they had never fully understood, who now had questions only the architect could answer. He drove up the morning of and came home the same night because Coop had hockey practice. He was in the parking lot of the rink, watching his son through the glass, when his phone buzzed with Sandra's name. He let it go to voicemail. She called again the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring. "I need to understand," she said. Her voice was not the voice of the woman who had slid the envelope across the table. That voice had been certain. This one was something else. All those years, Elliot, you let me believe. You let me stand in that kitchen and tell you that you were never going to be anything. And you just sat there. I know. Why? Why would you do that? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was gray with November. The rust-spotted van was gone now, replaced by nothing yet, because he had not gotten around to it. Because, he said carefully, I had been the other man before, the one who was something, and I watched what that cost. Silence on the line. There was someone before you, he said. Coop's mother. Her name was Isabel. He had not said the name to anyone in 4 years, and the saying of it cost something. When I was building Aldercroft, I was never home. I was in every important room and never in the room that mattered. And the people I did business with, the kind who see other people as instruments. When they wanted leverage over me, they reached for her. Not once, for 2 years. Until she got sick, and even then. He stopped. I sat in a hospital in Ottawa, and I understood that the thing I had built had eaten the person I loved most in the world. So I took Cope. He was 18 months. And I walked away and I rebuilt the operation through proxies and I moved us to a street where no one would think to look. A long silence. I married you as that man, he said. The quiet one. The one with the van. I hoped you had married him back. Sandra said nothing. I couldn't have shown you the truth to keep you, he said. The truth was the only thing guaranteed to change what you thought you were choosing. She started to say something. He waited. I made a mistake, she said finally. Elliot, I made a real mistake. Coop needs, we could try, for Coop. He looked at the window. The same fogged corners, the same yard. You didn't leave me because you were afraid of being poor, he said. It came out quietly, which was the only way he said hard things. I could have understood that. People are afraid. I know what fear does. He set his coffee down. You left because you decided I had no value. You walked out in front of our son, and you didn't look back. That's the thing I can't undo, Sandra. It's not what you found out. It's what you showed me before you knew. She was crying by then. He waited until she had finished. The car's running rough on the front left, he said. You should get the wheel bearing checked before winter gets worse. He said goodbye and set the phone down on the table. Sheldon Price's situation became apparent in stages, which is how these things always happen when a man has built upward faster than the foundation can hold. The capital behind 2 of his major development projects had come through a chain of intermediaries that Sheldon, who preferred the 30,000-foot view to the details, had never fully examined. When the chain was examined, and it was, once the Aldercroft disclosure made the provenance of certain fund vehicles a matter of public interest, the chain led back to a subsidiary of one of Aldercroft's holding structures. Sheldon had built his commercial portfolio in part on Elliot's money. He had done it without knowing. That was the truth, and Elliot was willing to let it be the truth. But the patient capital that had underwritten Sheldon's most ambitious project came with covenanters, and those covenanters came due, and the entity that administered them was no longer willing to extend the kind of informal forbearance it had previously offered. Sheldon made appointments he could not get. He left messages that were returned by lawyers. He called a press conference and said the words, "temporary liquidity challenge" 3 times in 4 minutes, and the reporters who wrote it up chose a different phrase. Sandra had tied her name to his publicly enough that the distancing was noticed when it came. Her firm, which managed communications for a list of clients that included several people who did business with Aldercroft, grew quietly formal with her in the way of institutions that have calculated a risk. She moved out of Sheldon's building 6 weeks after the disclosure. Elliot did not buy the rink where Co-op played hockey. That would have been too obvious, and obviousness had never appealed to him. He did buy the 3 commercial buildings on the block where Co-op schools sat, through a numbered company, and he quietly renegotiated the lease on the community center space that the Neighborhood Hockey Association had been worried about losing for 2 years. He did not attach his name to the negotiation. The association's president got a call from a property manager with good news and never knew who was behind it. He established a bursary at the school board level, in Isabel's name, for children in households below the median income. The first round went to 43 families. He did not attend the announcement. He did not raise his profile. He did not give the interview that 3 national outlets requested. He bought a new truck, not new exactly, 2 years old, clean, and drove Coop to school in it and stood at the fence at hockey practice and made oatmeal and went on being, as much as he could manage, the man on Cartwright Lane. It did not entirely work. The city had gotten hold of the story, and the story had gotten hold of the city's imagination, and there is no practical way to be the most significant private wealth disclosure in a decade, and also unremarkable. People recognized him now, sometimes, in the grocery store, in the parking lot of the rink. He was polite. He did not stop to explain himself. Coop handled it with the equanimity of a child who had watched his father handle everything quietly and concluded this was simply how things were done. "Cooper," a boy named Davis said at practice one Tuesday, "your dad is actually rich." Coop considered this while lacing a skate. "He fixed my bike 3 times, he said. Davis did not know what to do with that. Sandra found her way back to Coop slowly, the way a person navigates after their eyes adjust to a new light. She called. She showed up on Saturdays. She took him for breakfast and brought him back in the afternoon and was polite and careful with Elliot in the doorway. And he was polite and careful in return, because whatever had ended between the two of them, Coop had known her as his mother for most of his conscious life, and Elliot was not going to take that from the boy out of anything as small as spite. But Co-op was 9, and 9-year-olds hear what is said in kitchens, and the things said in kitchens do not dissolve just because the adults move on. He was warm with Sandra, sometimes. He was sometimes kind, but the easy trust, the uncomplicated reaching that had been there before, did not come back in the same form, because trust of that kind is not rebuilt on a schedule. It grows back, if it grows back, in its own time and on its own terms. Sandra was learning to sit with that. It was, Elliot thought, watching from a careful distance, probably the most useful education she had received in years. One evening in late March, Elliot was in the garage. The drop cloth was gone. The cabinet was gone, relocated to a proper office. The garage was just a garage again, tools on pegboard, Coop's bike hanging from a hook, the smell of cold concrete and machine oil. Coop came out in his socks and stood in the door the way he had stood in the hallway on the night this all began, small and still and listening. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. Did you know it was going to turn out okay?" Elliot set down the wrench he'd been holding. He thought about this. The honest answer was complicated in the way that honest answers usually are, and Co-op was 9, and 9 deserved as much of the truth as 9 could hold. "I knew some things," Elliot said. "I knew what I'd built. I knew that if I had to, there were things I could do." He looked at his son. "But I didn't know about us. I didn't know if I was going to be able to hold this part together." He gestured loosely, the garage, the house, the boy standing in his socks on cold concrete. "This was the part I wasn't sure about." Coop thought about this. He had his father's habit of taking a question seriously. "But you did," the boy said. "Yeah." Elliot picked the wrench back up. "We did." Coop leaned against the door frame a moment longer. "I'm gonna get my slippers," he announced, and went back inside. Elliot listened to the small footsteps cross the kitchen floor above him. Then he turned back to the workbench, and the ordinary sounds of the house settled around him. The furnace, the wind off the escarpment, the faint sound of the television Coop had turned on in the living room. A man who had once been named in the same sentence as the words "most significant private disclosure in Ontario in a decade" stood alone in his garage in a town no one had been looking for him in, and fixed a latch on a cabinet door that had been sticking since October, and found that he did not need the moment to be anything more than what it was. The measure of what a man protects tells you more about him than the measure of what he owns. I keep thinking about the cabinet in the garage, the one under the drop cloth and the old storm windows, the one Coop was told held important papers. It did hold important papers. It held everything. And nobody looked twice at it for 4 years because nobody looks twice at a carpenter's garage. That's the part of Elliot's story that stays with me longest. Not the disclosure, not the number in the headlines, the drop cloth. The choice to put the drop cloth there in the first place, and then to leave it there, year after year, while the world outside decided what kind of man he was. I think about what it actually takes to do that. To know what you're worth and say nothing. To sit at a kitchen table while someone tells you you'll never be anybody and not reach for the thing that would prove them wrong. That's not weakness. That's a specific kind of strength that most of us never develop because most of us never have to. We reach for the proof the moment someone questions us. We can't help it. The need to be seen correctly is one of the most human needs there is. But Elliot had learned something that most people only learn after they've already lost something they can't get back. He had learned that being seen correctly by the right people at the right time is worth more than being seen at all. He protected Coop with that knowledge. He rebuilt his life around it. And when Sandra slid that envelope across the table and told him he would never be anything, he let her believe it, not out of defeat, but out of a kind of clear-eyed integrity that I find genuinely hard to explain except to say he already knew who he was. He didn't need her to know it too. What Sandra mistook for failure was actually judgment. What she mistook for passivity was actually discipline. The rust-spotted van, the rented house, the furnace on a timer. None of it was the ceiling of his life. It was the floor he had chosen to build on, deliberately, for reasons that lived in an Ottawa hospital corridor and a name he still said carefully, even years later. And Sheldon. Sheldon is the other side of that coin. Sheldon had the appearance of someone building something real, and Sandra chose it because it looked like what she thought success was supposed to look like. But appearance maintained by borrowed confidence and unexamined capital is not a foundation. It's a delay. The collapse was not a punishment. It was just the natural end of something that had never been structurally sound. What I find myself returning to is Coop at the door of the garage in his socks, asking his father if he knew it was going to be okay. And Elliot saying, "This was the part I wasn't sure about." Not the money, not the fund, not the disclosure or the headlines. This, the boy in the doorway. That was the thing he had been trying to hold together all along, and the thing he was least certain he could. I think that's what it means to actually build something. Not a portfolio, not a reputation. A person. The kind of person who, when his mother doesn't look back at the window, stays on the couch quietly and understands, even at 9, the difference between the adults who chose to stay and the ones who chose otherwise. Elliot gave Coop that, not with money and not with a speech. He gave it by being there, consistently, in the ordinary way that consistency requires, day after day in a house that smelled of sawdust and cold concrete and a furnace running on a timer. That's the thing that doesn't make the headlines. It never does.